Hello and welcome to Mergers and Acquisitions, a multimedia blog and podcast brought to you by the Society for Economic Anthropology. I'm Ipshita and I'm bringing you another wonderful guest on our collection, Enterprise. Through this collection, we have been examining some of the ideas, narrative, practices, and actors who are involved in entrepreneurial labor. My guest today is Dr. Courtney Lewis, whose work provides a unique perspective on scholarship on entrepreneurship, particularly intersecting with economic stability and sovereignty. Dr. Courtney Lewis is currently an associate professor at the University of South Carolina, Columbia. A citizen of the Cherokee Nation, Dr. Lewis's overall work is in economic development for Native nations in the United States, and consequently issues of sovereignty related to economic sustainability and stability. Her research areas include economic anthropology, indigenous rights, economic justice, political economy, public anthropology, food and agricultural sovereignty, Native nation economic development, American Indian studies, race and entrepreneurship, and economic colonialism. Dr. Lewis is the author of Sovereign Entrepreneurs, Cherokee Small-Business Owners, and the Making of Economic Sovereignty, published in 2019, which is based on her ethnographic work with Indigenous small businesses. In fall 2022, Dr. Lewis is due to join the anthropology faculty at Duke University. Thank you so much for joining me today, Courtney.
Thank you for having me, Ipshita. It is really great to be talking with you today.
Great. Well, I just wanted to start off by asking you about your broader perspective on economic anthropology and how you feel it might relate to your work. So how do you think those connect, and what does economic anthropology mean to you?
Oh, what does economic anthropology mean to me? That's a big question. But I think for many people, they define economic anthropology in terms of the ways that people provision material goods. But for me, economic anthropology has always been, in its simplest terms, people and people's relationships. So not just to material goods, but relationships to each other, relationships to the environment, to ideologies. And with economic anthropology, we can see what people value through how they enact these relationships.
Right. And that is actually kind of maybe leading to your research and your interests in entrepreneurship particularly, and the kind of maybe meanings and significance that people attach to it. So could you tell me a little bit about what made you interested in this idea of economic sovereignty and entrepreneurship?
So I always knew that I wanted to work with Native nations, but it really wasn't until I was an undergraduate at Michigan that I found that I had an aptitude for economics specifically. So at that point, I decided that my focus would be Native nation economic development. And then I pursued both my bachelor's and then my master's in economics. But I found when I was considering my PhD, it became clear that modeling alone through economics would not do the work that I needed to accomplish with these Native nations. And I found economic anthropology. And the more I looked, the more I realized that it was a perfect fit for what my research goals were going to be. So at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, I spoke with government officials and citizens of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and they were the ones who mentioned their incredible small business sector that they have. And I was then able to draw from not only my Cherokee Nation citizenship, but my own personal experience in small business ownership, as well as my Cherokee family's small business experiences. So this would be my grandfather and grandmother. And I began work on the Qualla Boundary, which is the homelands of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians.
Yeah, that's really interesting, your journey from looking at it from the perspective of economics and economic development to discovering how anthropology, particularly economic anthropology, might provide you a slightly different lens. So when you were involved in these projects, both your previous ethnographic project and maybe you can tell us a little bit about the current projects you've been working on, I was wondering how you feel what kind of motivated your consultants and your research participants in being small business owners.
Well, their motivations varied widely. Some of these small business owners that I spoke with on the Koala Boundary are part of multi-generational families of small business owners. So they saw it as kind of a natural thing to do is start their own small business. And of course, they had the generational knowledge and the capital to help with this. Others, new small business owners, saw it as a way to support their community. And this is something that you see especially in locations where chain stores, for better or for worse, don't want to build. So these kind of rural areas. And therefore, you don't have things like a laundromat, right? And some just enjoyed being their own boss, which is, as many of us know, both a blessing and a curse at times. And then there were other folks who just had talents that lend themselves to small business ownership or kind of this autonomous work like artists, right? So really the motivations varied pretty widely on the Koala Boundary, even with a small population.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what that project was, which led to your book of Sovereign Entrepreneurs, and what you're working on currently, and how that interest evolved.
So my first book focused exclusively on Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, small business owners. So it was very specific in its scope, very specific in its location. I was able to dive pretty deeply into the practices of entrepreneurship, the conceptions of entrepreneurship, the challenges, the support networks, and what those can really tell us about our own conceptions of entrepreneurship, but also specifically for American Indians, what are the support networks and challenges that they face that a small business owner outside of a reservation would not have to face. So my first research project really focused on these small business owners, and it just happened to also occur during the Great Recession. So then I was able to bring in looking at how the diversity of small businesses really helps to support economies in these times of crisis. And for my next project, I'm going to continue focusing on American Indian entrepreneurs, but the focus actually gets even more specific. So what I'm going to be looking at are American Indian entrepreneurs working within a food sovereignty framework. So the topic is very specific, but the fieldwork itself is going to be much, much broader. So I'm going to be working with entrepreneurs across the country. So when I did my YouTube series last summer during the pandemic, we had people everywhere from Canada to California. And these were chefs that I interviewed during the pandemic to talk about owning these businesses, but also what they were doing, and this would be in June, at really the height of our lockdowns during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean that the first project that you referred to with the Cherokee small business owners and their specific ideas and practices of entrepreneurship, I was wondering if I could ask a follow-up question about that, which is kind of in relation to the general ideas that we have about entrepreneurship. And we sometimes maybe tend to think of it as a pretty neoliberal formation, which kind of doesn't really end up improving people's lives necessarily. How did your consultants and your participants conceptualize these practices and whether they actually felt a sense of economic sovereignty that related to those practices?
Um, so again, their conceptualizations of entrepreneurship varied pretty widely, but I will say that overall, um, there was more of a sense of community responsibility, and I think that ties into um, what I talk about in the book with economic sovereignty. So they wouldn't use that term. So my consultants wouldn't use the term economic sovereignty. But they do express it, and they express it in a way that might be maybe to Western ears a seemingly contradictory way. So it's both an autonomy and a community responsibility. Now, in the book, I define economic sovereignty specifically in relationship to Native nations. So, as their ability to exercise their inherent sovereignty through actions of economic self-determination. And for many of the folks that I work with, this translates to being able to autonomously make economic decisions, and that this economic decision making then allows them to build an economy that is robust enough and resilient enough to consistently and reliably serve the needs of its citizens. And entrepreneurship has a very big role for the Eastern Band in doing that. And so the Eastern Band government also has a greater responsibility to its small businesses because of that.
That's interesting. That makes it even more unique that you did that project in the background of the recession then, with that concept of stability and autonomy being so important to those who were kind of becoming entrepreneurs. I was wondering how, because your research has been specifically on the Native nations, when you focus on Indigenous entrepreneurs, American Indian entrepreneurs, what does that focus, you think, lend to anthropological discussions or generally academic discussions around entrepreneurship? Like I mentioned, there is, of course, a critical view of it, which is about neoliberalism and the ways in which entrepreneurship might be pretty restrictive, but perhaps your studies can make it a more nuanced idea of the ways in which people understand and interpret their entrepreneurial labor. So yeah, what does the focus on Indigenous entrepreneurship really provide us?
And you're exactly correct. So by focusing on Indigenous entrepreneurship and what constitutes it, this complicates our academic discussions by really forcing us to step away from these binary definitions of entrepreneurs as either inherently selfish and exploitative. So you've got your Bezos, your Musk, your Zuckerbergs, right? Or on the other hand, we also have this notion of a completely altruistic entrepreneur, right? This kind of noble entrepreneur. So it really forces us to complicate these notions and contextualize these notions, right? So is entrepreneurship the same on the Kuala boundary as it is in New York City? And in contextualizing entrepreneurship, specifically my work also exposes the way that governments like our federal government will go to great lengths to select entrepreneurs, right? So right now at this moment, I'm thinking of the Senate's proposed $10 billion bailout of Bezos's Blue Origin, right? But they will do this while actively suppressing other entrepreneurs, such as small businesses. And here I'm thinking about the refusal of the federal government to really offer meaningful help to small and medium-sized enterprises, including American Indian businesses, during the pandemic. right? So kind of stepping away allows us to see the context that these entrepreneurs are working in. So it's not just how they define entrepreneurship themselves, but how it's being built and structured around them, right?
Right, yeah. That's a huge sort of transfer of wealth from one type of entrepreneur to another type of entrepreneur. Maybe.
Absolutely.
That was a very interesting idea also that came up when you mentioned the importance of community and responsibility for American Indian entrepreneurs, because, as you said, it complicates this binary of this individualistic Steve Jobs, Elon Musk kind of heroic figure, quote unquote heroic, who's kind of charting out these paths all alone versus the do-gooder, altruistic, social entrepreneur. So, in what ways are community and responsibility at the center of meaning making for your consultants?
I would say that because what I'm working with is a smaller population, right? Where Eastern Band have maybe upwards of 15,000 citizens right now, and not all of them live or are able to live on the Kuala boundary. So I think, first of all, there's a different kind of responsibility when you're living in a community like that, where people know each other, they know your business practices, they're driving past you every day, right? So if you are taking more than you're giving, it's going to be pretty clear, right? And this is not to say that these noble entrepreneurs and that they donate 100% of their profits back to the people, but there is a responsibility in the sense that businesses engage with the community in a variety of ways. So are they donating money to the high school football team during times of need? Are they giving coupons for free fries to students who do really well? Right. So it's, are they helping out with lawn maintenance for elders? All of these kinds of things are things that we don't really engage with when we talk about entrepreneurship on these kind of upper levels. And I'm not even sure it's something that is actions that they take very consciously, as in I am contributing to this community in this particular way.
Right.
It's just what's expected in what you do. So the responsibility is built in just to the way the society expects people to act.
Yes, it's sort of like their everyday way of being as a small business. It's more intermeshed with the community.
Absolutely.
In terms of the funding for entrepreneurship, because in my own research in entrepreneurship, I keep coming back to this question of what helps them become entrepreneurs, and it's often that initial capital. So, with your research, did you see it was mostly the community, the family, that was the source of that initial capital investment, or even eventually to help them grow the business, or was it in fact other networks of gaining funding, including, say, even some forms of investment or venture capital or anything like that?
So there are a few ways that I saw the Eastern Band small business owners able to kind of tackle this issue of capital. And this is an extremely important and unique issue for American Indians, because if you live on a reservation, you cannot use that land as collateral for a loan. So already you are starting off unable to access capital that people not living on a reservation would be able to access. So this is extremely important to address. And for the families that are part of these multi-generational, they do have access to startup capital. They also have access to leasing space, which is very, very valuable and hard to get at times. So they do have a leg up. They also, again, have this generational knowledge of small business ownership, right?
Mhm.
Um, so in many ways, they have a leg up, but we also have an entirely different group of potential small business owners. And this is something that I worked with when I took what's called the Indianpreneurship class on the Qualla Boundary. It's a 9-week course, training course for new small business owners. Um, so in working with them, I also was able to find out a bit about what they were doing with this capital issue. Now, for the Eastern Band, they have a pretty successful casino market right now. So there are two things that are happening. One, Eastern Band citizens, as shareholders of this corporation, get paid dividends twice a year. They also, when they turn 18, receive an amount of money that is spread out over a number of years. And we see younger people using this money to start businesses. Right, so there's an ice cream store that just opened up 2 years ago, a kids' clothing store, from these young people using these startup funds. And with these dividend payments, because the town of Cherokee is a tourist town, in the winter, when it can be difficult, if not dangerous, to get to Cherokee, many stores will shut down for a few months and use this money to restock inventory and remodel. So that does help. It's not a lot of money, but it is some money. Now, to kind of fill in that gap, the Eastern Band also are able to, through their what's called their Sequoia Fund office, do loans for small business owners. Everything from micro loans to major, $250,000 loans. And they are able to work with a wider range of capital than most banks would. And because they are run within the Eastern Band government, they can even use land as collateral because if anything happens, it goes back to the Eastern Band, right? It's not going outside of Eastern Band ownership. So really, we've got family involvement, uh, dividend payments to a certain extent, and the ability of the Eastern Band government to not only create this economic development office, but also to fund it so that they can give loans. And that's unique. Not many casinos are actually profitable. A very small percentage of casinos are profitable. So in that respect, it's more difficult to duplicate the loan process, but not impossible. And I think one of the capital is difficult, and capital is difficult especially for American Indians because of these issues. However, the the other thing that is absolutely key is small business training. Absolutely. So they have the Indianpreneurship class. They also have smaller classes and lunchtime classes. But many people have a fairly romanticized view of small business ownership. And in this view, they forget to pay themselves a salary. Or, if they're artists, they're not charging enough for their time. They charge for materials and a little bit over that, but they're not charging for their time. Or they're not calculating, their taxes that they have to file quarterly correctly. So getting the information to people on how to create a small business plan, as boring as it is in the scheme of owning a business, maybe just as important, because I can give money to folks, but if they don't have the actual training to know how to best put that into different pots and then to spread that out over a year or 5 years to really get their footing, it's not going to help them. And then we've lost another American Indian small business. And that is a terrible thing to have happen.
So just to clarify that a little bit more, in terms of the small business training, is it the first-time entrepreneurs who are attending it, those who want to start a small business, or is it just something that you can attend at any point, even if you own a business and you want to, say, grow it or something like that?
So anybody can attend, and there are business owners who have owned businesses for a while, but take this course to become more up to date. In some cases, the course is required. So if you want to apply for tarot status, you are required to take this course. If you are an existing small business owner, however, there are other courses that the Eastern Band offer that would probably be a little bit more helpful and less intensive. So this, is a 9-week class, but they do have smaller classes that are literally called Grow It. So they try to cover the gamut of small business needs through training. Mm-hmm.
It kind of sounds a little bit similar to some of the incubator kind of programs that run and kind of get a lot of clients and potential entrepreneurs generally. And I was wondering, with the multi-generational interest in small businesses, do you find maybe younger entrepreneurs or younger folks within the community identifying with some of the mainstream discourses at all? Are they interested in, say, going and attending an incubator in, say, New York or Silicon Valley, or they want to, kind of be part of those more mainstream entrepreneurial discourses?
There are some younger folks who are attracted to that, but I'd say the majority, by a good amount, want to stay in the region, and they want to contribute to the Palo Boundary and the community. So there are a lot of Eastern Band folks that will leave and go to college elsewhere on the other side of the coast, but honestly, for the most part, they like where they are. And most of the younger folks that I spoke with are pretty happy to stay around that region and do what they can.
And moving on to the other project that you mentioned, which was also really interesting, and I know you mentioned doing field work with chefs, with entrepreneurs in the food sector during the pandemic. What kind of made you interested in that specific topic? I know you said you're interested in food and agricultural sovereignty generally. Is that what led you to become interested in entrepreneurs in that particular sector?
So I had been doing food work kind of as a parallel to my entrepreneurship project, basically since I did my initial graduate student work. So I have papers published on ramps, which is a wild onion that grows in the Great Smoky Mountains and kind of up the coast. So food work has always been kind of in the background of what I do. But when I was out doing this field work, I noticed that there were different complications that were coming up for food businesses than other types of businesses, than tourist businesses and artist businesses, software design, movie production. Food had very, very specific issues. And so it also happened at this time that food sovereignty began to really take hold. So I saw small business owners just within the past maybe 3 years doing something they hadn't done before, which is identify as part of a food sovereignty movement, right? And that's when it kind of clicked for me. And I realized that they were dealing with some potential conflicts in identifying as a business owner within this food sovereignty movement. So, for example, what do you do about selling seeds? So seeds aren't something that many Native Americans would sell. This would be something that you pass down to friends, to family, right? This is how we feed people, right? So what does it mean to sell seeds, right? And what does it mean to sell to non-natives, right? What does it mean when you're part of the food sovereignty movement, but you're shipping internationally, right? How does that resonate with something that is inherently emphasizing the hyperlocal, right? So I realized that there is a very, very robust, let's say, series of questions that come along with these particular folks. And I began with chefs for a couple of reasons. Actually, I'll go back. I didn't begin with chefs. I began first with a project that I co-PI'd with Dr. Rose Strimlau at Davidson, in which we did a series of panels. And the panels were all American Indian, dealing with policy, dealing with restaurants and other food businesses. And then the final one was agriculture and activism. So I've also published on the issue of growing cannabis on Native Nation land. So we had these panels, and then COVID hit. So 2 of our panels went online. We were able to hold one in person before anybody really realized how bad this was all going to be. 2 moved online, and the panel that we did on restaurants was so rich, and there was so much going on within the restaurant industry for American Indians that we decided to pivot our grant, which was a Mellon grant, to doing this YouTube series interviewing 7 chefs, Indigenous chefs, about their ownership experience and COVID experience. So that was really kind of the entree into this project.
With both of these, with the food sovereignty project and your previous project also, were there any recurrent or similar or even different challenges that you encountered with the ethnography? I know obviously COVID was a big challenge, but other than that, working with entrepreneurs in general, were there any, or small business owners, however they define themselves, were there any conceptual, methodological challenges that you encountered?
Let's see, challenges in my field work. So, I mean, we all come across things we don't expect in our field work, right? And I think one thing, so I didn't face major challenges at my field site, other than the fact that I ended up in the middle of a Great Recession. So the first project ends up in the middle of a Great Recession. This one ends up in the middle of a pandemic. I'm getting a little concerned about doing field work in the future, but other than the recession, I didn't have major challenges, but one factor at this particular site was that the tourist businesses that I was working with and interviewing were very competitive. So this meant that I had to overcome first the hurdle of being an anthropologist, since anthropology still has a very long way to go towards building trust with American Indians. But on top of that, there was also this possibility that I might have leaked product information to competitors because I was going to all different businesses. And really, I just addressed this by keeping all of my notes open and visible at any time to all of my consultants. And this transparency really became a paramount principle of my work.
Yeah, that is really interesting that they would feel that sense of, like legitimate concern that their products. Yeah, exactly. That's really interesting. And one of the last questions I was thinking about was in general with your interest in economic stability, sovereignty. Do you feel whether it's the food sovereignty movement, food entrepreneurs in the food sector, tourism, any other kind of sector, do you think with the larger economy of native nations that this is a sustainable path, that entrepreneurship provides a sustainable means of pursuing sovereignty and stability?
I think that entrepreneurship is a part of it. And I think that it's a part that has been ignored and dismissed. Do I think that entrepreneurship is the key to economic sovereignty? No, I don't think it's the key. But also, I believe that very few things are the keys to anything, right? I think that when you're talking about stability, you need to strategize. You have to have multiple paths. And when you're talking about the stability of an entire nation, you cannot just rely on entrepreneurship. You cannot just rely on gaming. You cannot just rely on, tourism or one specific business. And that's hard for Native nations because, again, when you have, 15,000 citizens, how do you diversify in a way that keeps everybody employed and that keeps your nation funded so that you can actually care for your citizens? So having said that, I think entrepreneurship is an important part. I don't see, just because of many structural issues, American Indians need to fill some of these gaps themselves. So I think that will always be a part of it. But I think that it's kind of a larger package of how we create reliable and stable economies.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just kind of maybe what you just said, so kind of in addition to that would maybe be the idea of value, which I was wondering, obviously their deep involvement within the community and the aspect of economic stability, but what are some of the larger ideas of value being created by small business owners within these nations, within the native nations? Do you think they have it's a certain type of moral value, whether the entrepreneur has a specific status within the society, whether it's a community value or kind of a cultural value associated with being a small business owner? So did you have any thoughts on that?
So the place of entrepreneurship, besides this community responsibility, a lot of times, of course, we use the word diversification, right? It adds a diversification, but I don't think diversification means the same thing on a small reservation like this that it does when we talk about it in larger economic systems. Diversification isn't just kind of a catchy phrase that means, we're creating this great, wide variety of stable bases. What we're dealing with, especially on reservation, are voids. We have food voids, right? We have basic need voids that just aren't being filled. For the Eastern Band and most of the Appalachian region, they didn't have internet access until the Eastern Band was able to build their own fiber optic network, right? So when I talk about diversity, it's not just in kind of creating this whole diverse foundation, but really it's about addressing voids, right? How do people get food? We're living way in the mountains, and unfortunately people can't see my background right now, which is the Great Smokies behind me. It may take you an hour, 2 hours, to go from your house if it's way, way back, to access something if there's not some sort of small market nearby, right? So when I talk about diversity, it's really about creating access for people. And that is also the way many people there view this kind of entrepreneurship as well.
Right. And just the last question would be something that you raised about long kind of work that needs to be done by anthropologists to build trust with native nations, with communities who legitimately don't necessarily trust anthropologists. Anything that you would suggest not entrepreneurs necessarily, but field workers, ethnographers, anthropologists to keep in mind, maybe economic anthropologists or otherwise, when they're doing these projects, when they're in the field, any advice that we can kind of keep in mind?
One thing I would say is that if people are working with Native nations and American Indians, collaboration is not an option. Is not collaborating is not an option, right? Collaboration is compulsory. And I mean serious participatory field work, right? So when you go there, having your university IRB is one thing, but you also must go through the IRB process. And I cannot stress this enough because this is still a problem at the Native Nation, right? You need to be working tightly with not only the government of the Native Nation itself, but the people there. And you must be transparent. All of these, again, compulsory. It's not an option to go in, do your field work, kind of on the down low, and then write your book, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, and I see that changing today, but I also see a lot of room for growth. I have seen mistakes made, sometimes pretty serious mistakes. And also I've seen a lot of kind of back patting when anthropologists do consult with American Indian people. And I think we need to step back from that because that is literally the minimum that you should be doing is working collaboratively with Native peoples if you are profiting and benefiting from research about them. So this is obviously something that I strongly believe in.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you so much for a unique, distinctive perspective that you brought to this collection about your experience working with entrepreneurs who have such a different experience of what entrepreneurship means, what owning a business means, the challenges they face, the opportunities and the way they see it also. Like you said, we kind of tend to fall into binaries sometimes, thinking about things like entrepreneurship in a very mainstream way. And I think your work is so important in disrupting that and helping us understand the more nuanced experiences that different people, different communities have being entrepreneurs. Thank you so much again for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a great discussion.
Thank you.